Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you might be. We're just filling in and opening the room. So we'll take about a minute more before we formally kick off. Now, just to sort of test the setup, I'd like to welcome everyone. And again, we haven't quite started yet. But if you guys want to just give us a heads up or a thumb or a okay, if you can hear us and you can see us okay. Excellent. Now we're just going to test the technology. So this is Chris from Norway, and we're going to test Rita. So Rita, if you just quickly test and say hi.
Hi there, how are you? It's a chilly afternoon here in New Jersey.
All right, so we're still counting a few more people coming in. Just out of curiosity, if you guys want to just state your name and kind of where you're tuning in from. Last time we've done these, we've had people from basically all over the world, and it's always interesting to see where people are tuning in from. So we have Italy, we have Portugal, Stockholm, Panama, Denmark, here we go, New Jersey, Calgary, Barcelona. It looks nice. Are you serious? It's snowing in Pittsburgh? We actually had the first day of summer here in Norway. Natal, Italy. Wow, this is quite a crowd. Excellent. All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you to this webinar. Some of you might have followed us previously and know this is the fifth in a series that we're testing out. We're getting some pretty cool feedback, so I'm very happy to introduce today our topic, 3 levels of business models, with a special guest, Rita McGrath, professor and strategy thinker, tuning in from New Jersey. So, Rita, you want to say a few words before we launch off?
Sure, it's a pleasure to meet any group of that Christian convenes. It's always entertaining and great. And he had written to me about, maybe participating sometime. And then he said, well, can you be here on Thursday? I said, yeah, we can make that happen. So it's being very agile at the moment.
Excellent. So welcome, everyone. So my name is Christian. And we're very happy to have Rita. She basically turned up on a day's notice and said, let's throw this together and test and see how it goes. So I really hope that you guys tuning in from Italy, Brazil, Portugal, Pittsburgh, Somaliland, I hope you enjoy it. As always, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, either to myself or to Rita or to any of us, just fire away, and we will do our best to answer any questions as we go. And we'll make sure to stay until the last person has gotten their answers all covered up. So we can stay here all night if you guys want to. But the topic today is really something that I'm really passionate about. And it's also something that Rita has been doing a lot of work on that she'll be sharing with us today. And it's a simple idea that is really hard, challenging, and complex to execute in practice. And that is, how does a company, whether it's a big company or a small company, move from a mindset and a strategy of having one business model to having many business models in parallel? We call it, and we're going to introduce you to a tool that we've developed years back called the 3 levels of business models. So the topics, and Rita, maybe I'll kick this over to you. What are your initial thoughts? Why do you think companies should think in terms of business model portfolios?
Well, the theory of the case is that every business that you're running, unless you're a very, very simple company, is going to be at a different phase in its life cycle. And so different business models make sense at different phases in an organization's life cycle. So just as an example, when you saw Adobe go from essentially selling shrink-wrapped software in a box to selling software as a service on the cloud, the maturing of the technology and the maturing of Adobe's business model meant a different set of constraints was important. And so that's an example of you've got 2 different models now kind of coexisting side by side.
and many of you are probably familiar with Microsoft kind of going through that exact same shift
Yeah.
in moving from the good old boxes and DVDs to the cloud, which I think the Adobe case and also Microsoft and many others, they sound easy, Netflix easy, but
very difficult.
Very difficult. So if you go to the second, again, this is our introduction slide, Rita. You know, the quick and dirty. How can companies go about doing this? How can they develop business model portfolios?
How do they do it? Well, I'm a big believer in looking at the investments that you make in a portfolio that reflects how much uncertainty there is. So the very, very biggest payoff things are often the most uncertain, and you don't want to bet the company on those too early. And yet your core business, that's business for today, that has to be healthy as well. So you need that balance between what am I reaching for in the future and what am I good at today?
Yeah. And again, you know, you make it sound easy. It's easy on paper, but when we get down to it, some of the work that we've been doing in the energy area, it's incredibly complicated.
It is. Yeah, it is.
So
especially in a business like that, Christian, which has such huge amount of fixed assets to it. You know, it's much easier to do in an asset light business, you know, software or services or something like that. Very difficult when you've got, you know, hundreds of millions of kroner or whatever in the ground.
And still you might not have a choice.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Excellent. So one of the things that we'll be doing today is we'll showcase you and kind of go in depth on some tools. We have some tools that we have been developing with strategy tools, and Rita has been for the last about 2 years' time been working kind of diligently on developing Valise, which is a software suite with fairly advanced, complex, very, very impactful and interesting tools, and she'll be sharing some of that later as well. And then as we sort of wrap up, we'll try to have some questions, have some dialogue on some key leadership advice.
Great.
On this journey. Does that sound? Are we on the same topic here, Rita?
I think we are.
Excellent. Wonderful. So many of you know this. I'll just repeat it again. A lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about today, you can go online and you can download it for free. We have this toolkit under strategytools.io. Currently, there's about 15 tools. We have one more brand new in the making. We're still working on the final designs. We have handbooks and guidebooks coming out. So you can find a lot of the stuff that we talk about online today for free. Rita, you want to briefly introduce Valise as well?
Sure. So the concept behind this was to create scalable interventions in your innovation process to allow you to achieve growth at scale. And it builds on some earlier work that I've done on discovery-driven growth. So a set of replicable tools that you can use to impose the right kinds of disciplines on your organization. So there's portfolio management, there's planning the tool, there's thinking about how you select projects. So there's a nice little bundle of things starting to come together, which can help you do the right things when you're trying to operate under uncertainty. So that's really what Valise is all about. And it's helping people do it, you know, by building capability. You know, we don't want to have to be just always turning to the consultants. We want you to be working independently on your own.
Wonderful. Those of you not familiar with Valise, you can go online, check it out, read about some of the things, and hopefully many of you will find it interesting enough to actually reach out and have a discussion with Rita. Now, she will be talking more about it towards the end of this webinar, so if you had any plans to leave early, don't, because you're going to want to catch this towards the end. I've noticed many of you are already on. You're on the chat box and you're raising hands. And again, any questions, any comments, fire away. So brief introduction to myself. I'm a 15+ year consultant and advisor on strategy and increasingly on large scale transformation. I'm also business school faculty. And for the last 7 years, kind of a designer and co-founder of strategy tools. Rita, you want to cover your background briefly?
Sure. So I've been at Columbia Business School now for, oh goodness, 25 years or so, and have been working on, tools around innovation and, how companies can be smarter about it, how we take innovation and make it more of a discipline. And a lot of that involves really dealing with the business models, different business models, and different ways that you can think about those opportunities.
And you've been repeatedly ranked in the Thinkers 50.
I
Most
have been.
recently
I've
in
been in the
Denmark.
top 10. We like to say the top 10, which has been exciting. I've also won the Strategy Award, so the kind of Lifetime Achievement Award for Strategy from Thinkers 50, which was great. That was right around the time my last book came out, which I noticed behind you there, Christian.
Well, I'm glad you noticed. It's
Excellent marketing. Excellent marketing. And the other one to look at is this one here, which is discovery-driven growth. And I'll be talking about the tools that we're putting together that come out of that as part of Valise a little later in the webinar.
Thank you. So as we kick off, I want to give a kind of a big shout out to the team at Strategizer. Those of you familiar with Strategizer, Alan, Yvi, Alex, know that a lot of the work that we are doing today around business model portfolio is kind of building on work that they did all the way back to 2008. So the early work around business models really developed quickly. Insight and Clay Christensen were doing their work. Alex and colleagues in Switzerland were doing their work. And it's really been fantastic to see how the business model generation, the book, and the business model canvas, the tool that you see here, has kind of really raised a standard of understanding, if you will, of what is a business model, how do we apply it, how do we use it. Now, what we've been doing and what we're going to be talking about today is this very simple thing, moving from having one business model, that's the foundational understanding, and onto having many, which we call having a business model portfolio. So a lot of our work builds on Alex and the guys, and they're doing wonderful things. So going back to, I'm actually going to take you back to Denmark, to Copenhagen. We were working on the very first generation of strategy tools, and we kind of came up with this concept that we eventually shaped into the two lenses of strategy. And we're going to have that as a sort of a introduction framework for today. And hopefully some of you will recognize it and some of you will find it useful. So the two lenses of strategy is it's kind of a basic understanding of two very different perspectives on strategy. Now, the first perspective, if we simplify a little bit, is really strategy as analysis. So this is kind of a fact-driven, very analytical, we call it also very linear, very logical understanding of strategy. Now, what's important here is that the actors, the management, the board, CFOs, they have consciously or subconsciously an understanding or an assumption that the future will be pretty much like the present. Now, this is important because the underlying assumption is business will go on as it has been. We don't see any major disruption. We don't see any major change. We don't see any major new competitors, new technologies, new platforms coming in. So, yes, there will be some change, but in reality, things will stay the same. So that's the underlying assumption. Now, in this perspective, there's really a strong, again, very often a subconscious understanding that, we have one singular business model. So we should, of course, preserve and defend at all costs. We can tune it, we can tweak it, not too much, but we always talk about a business model in the singular. Now in this perspective on strategy, we use often traditional tools like the SWOT and the PESTLE and the 5 forces, which are all very good and very valuable tools, but perhaps they're not as adaptable to the environment that you're in, right? Now, Michael Porter is a well-recognized academic and expert in the field, and he, to a large extent, would advocate this perspective. And for many companies, this is a very, very dominant perspective on what is strategy. Now, the other, where many of you would recognize Rita's book and many of her books, much of her writing is what we call strategy as innovation. Now, strategy as innovation is fundamentally creative, fundamentally adaptable, changing. The ambitions and the mindset is probably much more explorative, much more ambitious, much more future oriented. What's important is really this, that at a strategic level, the company knowingly or unconsciously has and develops a portfolio of business models. And I've seen, and probably you as well, Rita, that there's a number of companies that they don't really have the language for it. They don't really know what they're doing, but they are actually, and in fact, developing a broad portfolio of business models just by good management, but not necessarily having the tools and the language.
Or they're doing it by accident. They're sort of flailing around. If you think about Ford right now, I kind of think they're in this, we're going from being a car company to being a mobility company, but nobody really knows what that means yet. So they're buying startups and they're investing in these sexy new technologies and they're doing all this stuff. But you don't get the impression that they've made their bet yet. They're still at the exploratory stage.
No, exactly. And what we've seen, and probably many of you following this webinar as well, is that a lot of companies have this traditional strategy as analysis perspective. And it's kind of embedded in their systems, the processes, and the financial decisions. And this bringing this strategy as innovation perspective is very, very challenging when you get into the organizational structures and decision-making bodies. So this two lenses of strategy is really a starting point. And it brings us into the key message today: develop and test a large portfolio of business models. Now, this is easier said than done. Many companies, knowingly or unknowingly, will continuously talk about having one business model. And one example, a wonderful company, it's a client of ours. We worked with it for years. They have about 40,000 employees. Their products are sold in about 198 countries around the world. So most of the world has these products. But they have one singular business model. It's a company that is extremely good on product innovation. They keep coming up with new products. They keep coming up with new brands. They keep coming up with new category products. But when you look under the hood, it is a company who's really focusing. They have a language, they have structure, they have processes for having a singular business model, which most likely is going to be very challenging moving forward. What do you think, Rita?
Well, what's happening now is that we're seeing a bunch of really big inflection points, and that's actually what my next book is about. We're talking to publishers, in fact, in 2 weeks, so it's exciting. But the inflection points around people don't want to own assets anymore. They want access to them. People don't want products. They want experiences or services or solutions. So if you don't have any DNA around that, that gets to be very difficult to meet those different kinds of needs.
Now, I can probably reveal that I've been privileged to some more insights around Rita's new book. So stay tuned and make sure you pre-order it when it gets out. It's going to be very interesting. Now, a traditional example that I know many of you are familiar with is of course, Blockbuster and all of the video and all of the movie industry. Now, Blockbuster, of course, focused on renting movies. But what a lot of people don't know is that they actually invented the streaming as a category well ahead of Netflix. Now, this is important, so I'll repeat this. Blockbuster, the movie rental giant, they had 60,000 employees. They had more than 9,000 stores. They invented the online streaming category before Netflix really did. But they got new management. They got new major shareholders. And the new management looked at business and said, no, we need to focus on our core business models, which is really the store. And management looked at all the numbers, they looked at the growth rates, they looked at what we now would call the inflection points, and said, no, we need to focus on one business model, and it has to be built around the stores. So whatever we do, it has to be about bringing people into the stores and giving them movies. Now, if that's a strategic mindset, that is going to be challenging. And what they ended up doing was, rather than having two competing business models, a physical store and an online streaming, they basically said, away with the streaming and focus on the stores. You mentioned Ford earlier. I mean, Ford could hypothetically say, we don't think this mobility thing is going to be such a big thing. We think that people will always own cars because they have always, for the last 150 years, been owning cars. But Rita, do you see kind of this strategic understanding shifting, meaning does more management team understand as a principle that they should be developing business model portfolios?
I think at places like Ford, they do. I think Ford's been, and in fact, they've been working a lot with our friends over at Innosight to think about what their new things are. So let me spend just a second on what a strategic inflection point is, because I think it's relevant to this conversation. So if you think about any company or any business model, in fact, it's informed by what's possible at the time. So take automobiles, right? So the reason we own cars is because that's the only way on a mass scale that many of us think about mobility. In places where there isn't public transportation and so forth, that's the only real option. So an inflection point is something that dramatically changes the nature of constraints that a particular business model operates under. And retail here is actually a really good example. Traditionally, your metrics, your model in retail was all driven by the fact that you had limited square footage of retail space. And so every metric you had was limited by that. Comes the digital revolution, and now all of a sudden you're not limited anymore by what you can do in a physical footprint. And so the constraints of that model just blow open. And so that's the first thing you look for when you're trying to get a business model shift in the early stages. Now, I'm not saying jump on it really early because it's probably too early and the ecosystem isn't complete yet. And that's where I think we are with both electric vehicles and self-driving cars. I think it's just too early. It's like the early days of the internet, right? Everybody's saying, oh my God, land grab, invest, boom, it'll, get in early. It's too early. The necessary ecosystem isn't there. We don't know how cars are going to be regulated, insured, how safety is going to be driven, how stoplights are going to need to change. I mean, there's so much undone in that ecosystem that it would be too early. So I think with Blockbuster, their big mistake was not realizing that once you had the real ecology of streaming available, why would anybody want to go to a physical store to pick out a movie?
Now, and of course, the parallel between the physical movie and owning the car as a physical asset is quite striking, although they're very different industries. Mm-hmm. So as a principle, taking out of Rita's work, several books, and how we look at the tools, we generally suggest to virtually every company that you should at least be thinking about how do we move to having many business models. This is not really new. You can go back to multiple sources. One of our kind of semi-classics, if you will, is April 2004 and the ambidextrous organization, which of course is an organizational structure which you should have parts of the business focusing on operating the core, while you have parts of the business exploring the new. Again, as a principle, it's easy, but it's hard to do. I'm going to tell you a story. And this is a client case that we worked on a couple of years ago. And it's a story about peanuts. And it's a story about a business model dilemma. Now, business model dilemma is something that we often explore with clients and executives. And they open up some very interesting conversation. Now, for this story, Peanuts was a Norwegian IT consulting company that ran into a strategic structural challenge that we call business model dilemma. So their business model was, we hired smart, fairly young people, and we hired them out as consultants, as IT consultants. And they do a really good job. Now, the problem they had was that they had kind of run into a market of consulting model, hourly rate of $129. And 98% of the revenue from this company came in from that model. And that really took care of the bread and butter, or the milk and bread, sort of the high volume, low end part of the business model. But the problem they faced was that we don't have any margins. We have these good people, and we put them out to the market. We have high billing rate, we have high utilization rate, but we don't have any margins. What should we do? And that was the dilemma. So they said, okay, should we hire a lot of young people and kind of let them learn, give them wings? We can probably give them less salary, but there's certain limits that you can't. So that wasn't really an option. Should we go out and find new people? Simply bring in slightly more senior people, which translated looks like a slightly older senior specialist, hourly billing 149. At least you're $20 up per hour, which adds to your margins. But again, they probably ask higher salaries, so it evens out. It just wasn't a very attractive structural business model. Now, category-wise, I'm not going to come back to that in a few minutes. It was more in what we call a consulting category. It was more attractive. It was more interesting. It had more learning, and it had slightly higher margins, but it still wasn't very structurally attractive. So they considered, should we hire a lot of people? Should we bring in a bus load? Should we bring in a plane load? Should we bring in like all of these people and basically significantly ramp up our headcount, which of course creates havoc on your cash flow and your operating capital? Could we add lots and lots of people and try to sort of slowly? But what they realized was that within this business model, they were fixed. They weren't really exploring business model innovation. They were just tweaking people and prices. So we ended up, they ended up calling me. I came in and asked them some moonshot questions. Or really, what they told us was, Chris, you ask really, really annoying questions. I don't know, Rita, you probably get this too sometimes.
All the time.
Some of them even said they're really bad questions, really stupid questions, and that's sometimes a good thing. Now, the questions that we started asking, and maybe this is something that some of you use frequently, is what would it take, right? Now, IDEO and the Kelly brothers, they've written extensively about creative confidence and kind of framing the right strategic questions. Lisa McKay on Strategic Conversations used the same thing. Like, what would it take to get to, and then we started exploring, what would it take to get to $200 per hour? It's more, but again, it's not structurally different. It's just pushing the margins. What would it take to get a better distribution between your low end and your medium end work? Maybe a 50-50 distribution. What would it take to get a higher distribution toward a higher? But we realized that with all of these, we were just tweaking the existing business model. We were increasing the prices, looking at utilization rates, but they were all very questions within the box, if you will. And then we asked, what would it take for us to charge $5,000 per hour and have 80% of company revenue coming from this category that we call the swing for the fences? And that just opened a whole different lens. Now, naturally, you could say, you can't really take young IT people and hire them out to your existing customers within the existing brand and within the existing framework and just charge $5,000 an hour. It does not work, at least not for very long. So you would have to do something structurally different. Now, what happened within this company was that opened a brand new conversation. And I think that's incredibly important. Very often you need to get the people that own the problem, people that are actually going to do the job, into the conversation. Created brand new conversations. They said, well, this is a mind shift. It's energizing. But they also said, serious dude, that's totally unreasonable. That's silly. That is, you can't just go from charging $129 per hour to $5,000 per hour. It's just stupid. We would expect better. Well, somebody said, and unfortunately we have enough management to say, well, let's try it. What would it take? A few months later, they launched something they had never seen before called Bologna Collaboration. And what they realized in that process was embedded within the company. There were skills, capabilities, experiences that they could repackage from hourly consulting model to a system development model. Basically translated, they built their own products. And they built their own products very close to existing customers. So they had instant access to existing customers that needed these things. And these customers weren't very happy to pay traditional hourly rates, but they wanted solutions to their problems. And once Peanuts realized this, they said, well, if we reorganize our work, we move away from the hourly billing model, we build systems, and we can scale these out at a totally different model. And this really drove revenue. It drove new client acquisition. It drove new projects. It really strengthened the brand. But most importantly, it created a structural, different business model with very different unit economics, very different headcount, and very different client income side. About 2 years later, the company was acquired by a strategic owner, and what they acquired was not an hourly billing company, but a systems company that had a business model portfolio that looked like this. Yes, they still had some very talented, fairly young IT professionals, and they did hourly billing. They had a handful of slightly more senior, slightly more expert people that still did hourly billing. They managed to get higher rates. But the real gold, or the real revenue side, the real income side, the real value driver in this company at the time was really this system that they could repackage and sell in a very, very different way. What the company Peanuts did, and working with these three levels of business models, was really understand at a very simple level that you don't have to put all your eggs in one basket. You don't need to have consultants on hourly billing maximum rates. You can actually balance activities. We have three categories, and there are many business model portfolio tools that you can use, but we have three categories. Category number one is your bread and butter, your milk and bread. This is kind of your low income, low margin, maybe you want to call it your safe and steady and boring work. It's quite repetitious, and for knowledge worker over time, it quite easily becomes boring. You move into a higher category. We define that category as consulting. It's usually more challenging, more difficult, more interesting. The client requests are more complex, more complicated, and generally it requires more creative thinking. You usually have better margins on those types of business models. But finally, you have what we call swing for the fences, which is also kind of handpicked out of Google's lingo. This is really audacious, challenging, difficult, wicked problems business models where you don't really know how you're going to solve it. You don't really see an easy solution, and there's a very, very high failure rate, which is fine as long as you handle the risks. This is where a company like Airbus would say, how do we make flying cars become a reality? We're not going to do it within the traditional organization, but we might partner up with a Chinese company in Shenzhen and do Sao Paulo, Brazil as our test bed, and we'll do the revenue side coming from advertising and Red Bull in-flight sales. So this would make sense for a traditional car manufacturer, but in the swing for the fences category, you really open up for some broad exploration, discovery-driven exploration, and really testing out crazy ideas. Now, some companies, they will say, we have one business model, it's safe, it's stable, and we shouldn't touch it, we shouldn't tweak it too much. Don't touch. Some companies will say, you know, we have one dominant business model and then we have a few small growth projects on the side. Some might say, yeah, we have a balanced portfolio. And you might have a startup who's doing incredibly crazy stuff and say, we have two potential business models. They're both insanely difficult, but if they work, we can exit with 100 million profit in 6 months. You know, it's extremely high risk, but also potentially extremely high reward. Now, we suggest to companies, big or small, to understand this and to balance this out. Develop a portfolio. Understand that some of these will be fairly stable for some times. Some of these will probably not last very long. Some of these will be more risky. And some of these also, as you can see in this illustration, will probably fade away over time, where you can spin out your business model. You can close it down before you're forced to, as a natural mechanic of what Rita called the resource allocation process. So these are simple principles, but they're very challenging to do. Now, when we have analyzed the innovation engine behind Google, we find these principles repeat themselves, where you really can go out and map out, you know, where's Google making most of its money? Well, it's search, advertising, but you spot in all their projects, they're not technology projects per se, they're business model projects with very different revenue mechanisms from the traditional core business. Same thing with Tesla. A lot of people look at Tesla and they see a car and it's like, hey, it must be a car company, which is maybe true as of today. But most people have known for many years that Tesla is really a business model portfolio company with energy, with solar, with battery. And what you're seeing here is a very interesting Morgan Stanley analyst report from 2014 that basically said everyone, mostly utilities and energy companies, Rita, they need to understand that Tesla is really a business model portfolio company, not a car company, but a very broad energy and technology company. So why do we do this? And I'm going to sort of close out this section before I hand it over to Rita again with an example from this company, Statoil. Some of you might have heard me talk about Statoil previously. It's an energy company. It's an oil and gas company formerly. It's now changing its name from Statoil to Equinor to reflect the quite sudden change from an oil-driven company to a much more broad, much more business model portfolio company. Over the last 2 years, the company has really developed significant investments, significant resource allocation, significant new emerging business models around clean energy. They're taking a much broader perspective where they look at markets, technologies, and new business models and capital discipline and how this is coming together. And a lot of the, large oil and gas companies from outside of this region is really studying Statoil and said, how come a company the size, a company with a capex, a company with the sunk investments like Statoil were able to do this? So why do we do this? Well, and Rita, I'd be happy to hear some of your thoughts here. This really is relevant when companies face uncertainty. If you believe your environment is changing, a business model portfolio might be just required. It might also be relevant to develop new profit engines. It's definitely a way of handling exploration of new ventures. And it is, for a lot of companies, really a portfolio strategy to develop new structural value drivers if your old value drivers are losing its relevance. But what would you say, Rita, before we turn it over to your end? What do you think is the biggest reason why companies should really be exploring and investing in business model portforios?
Well, I think the biggest reason is if you buy the idea, as I do, that advantages are transient, that they have a period of time when they're created and a period of time when you can exploit them, and then they go away. If you're just doing one thing, then that leaves you very vulnerable to that one thing becoming irrelevant. And obviously, you don't want to be in that situation.
Like we said in the introduction, traditional strategy will very often teach you to focus on your core business, optimize and defend, erect barriers to entry, erect moats. But it's changing. We're getting new research, we're getting new literature. A wonderful new piece that just came out in MIT Sloan Management Review last year on building a winning business model portfolio. Many of you hopefully probably know, and maybe I even have met Steve Blank out in California, who's been talking about this business model portfolio principle for quite some years now. So that's my sort of high level, quite quick introduction. You can find the 3 levels of business models on strategytools.io. We will be publishing the how-to book sometime late next week, based on some work that we're doing right now. And we have really seen in large companies and small companies, including our own, the impact, if you will, of being able to develop not one business model, but a broad portfolio. So Rita, we're going to try, see if we can switch the slides over to you.
Okay.
See how that goes.
All right, let me see. Are we good? Can you see now? Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Great. Let me just switch to presentation mode. I find sometimes it, there we go. All right, we should be in business now, are we?
Yeah.
Looking good.
Okay, so it's ironic because I brought Steve Blank up as well, because he just exemplifies this idea of thinking like a habitual entrepreneur, and they're always looking for different kinds of business models, different ways that people can earn money by doing things a little bit differently. And among the principles that you'll see somebody like Steve there. So one of the things I thought would be interesting for this audience is to have a look at what distinguishes an attractive business model from one that isn't. And so this is an actual diagnostic that I have created. I've just put it in PowerPoint form here, but what it basically says is if you've got a 7-point scale, are you more like the model on the left or are you more like the model on the right? And so if you think about it, switching costs, right? If switching costs are low, it's a less sticky business model. If it's based on individual transactions, which have to be repurchased each time, so there's no kind of habit formed. So a subscription model or a long-term contract that renews is much more attractive than every morning I wake up and I decide whether to buy this thing or not. If the model is the same, the user interface is the same, that's less sticky, that's less good than something where different providers, you have to learn how one provider works. And so even, like those of us that are still using Microsoft products, I mean, you may not love them, but having gone through the pain of learning how to use them, rather than go through the pain of learning how to use something else, you'll just stick with them. And so this little checklist is really just a way of thinking about, relative to choices that I have to make strategically, is this particular model less or more attractive? And so it's a quick way of just sort of assessing whether you're heading in the right direction with your particular model. The other thing that I think is really important to think about is, as Christian mentioned, this notion of discovery-driven planning. And one of the big uses of discovery-driven planning is to actually identify what your business model could be. And so just a brief word on discovery-driven planning. It has its roots in a study that I do of corporate flops. These are the things people tried that really didn't work out. And in retrospect, they weren't very bright ideas. And when you look at them, what you find is this consistent pattern. Untested assumptions taken as facts, very few opportunities for testing things at a low cost level. Not many opportunities to do what Peanuts did, right? Which was really say, let's think completely differently than we've ever thought before and see where that would take us. So what we find is that when you're in an environment which requires making a lot more assumptions than in an environment where you have a lot of knowledge, we call that the high assumption to knowledge ratio situation. And the job there is to really do a lot more learning than running around trying to prove that you were right. And so that's really the concept behind discovery-driven planning. It has these following steps, right? So you start off with, what would make this worthwhile? So to go back to the peanuts example, who would pay me $5,000 an hour to do something for them? Like, what would, like, and outrageous as that sounds, that can help start framing a thought process. So then you work backward from that and say, what would I have to do to be competitive in the market? What do I have to do to operate this thing? What are the assumptions I'm making? And how do I unfold my plan to learn about these new opportunities in a way that makes sense given the lack of knowledge that I've got? So the picture here you want is this profile, right? Where in the beginning, when you've got a huge range of uncertainties, you want to keep your investment low, right? Because you don't know much and you don't want to put too much effort behind one particular model. As you learn, as your knowledge increases and your assumption to knowledge ratio gets smaller, that's when you can allow your investment to increase. So that's the model I'd encourage you to have behind your heads as you're thinking about these different business models. And I am pleased to say, Christian was mentioning valise earlier, that one of the things we're doing with valise is we're taking these kinds of ideas, the ideas that were in discovery-driven planning and my later work on competitive advantage, and turning them into tools. And so the first toolkit, I'll call it, has the following, where we've got a little quiz which you can take that shows you how discovery-driven your mindset is. We've got some ways of screening projects against your strategy. So, you know, is this project in or out of scope? We have a portfolio tool as well that we use. It's very similar to the Three Horizon model. We have a way of assessing whether something's worth doing or not with what we call a bare bones net present value. So what that asks you to do is say, tell us how much you think it's going to cost to launch this thing. How long do you think it'll be in the market, and when's it going to go away? And out of those inputs, we can actually say, well, yeah, it kind of looks like this is worth doing or not. And then the other tools that go with discovery-driven planning, having to do with reverse income statements, documenting your assumptions, how do you build the model, how do you identify the checkpoints that you want to go through, and then how do you run a checkpoint review meeting? And then the hardest thing of all is, how do you disengage? So when you've learned that that it's time to exit some kind of business, how do you learn to do that? So this is a toolkit we're just putting the finishing touches on it now. So those of you who have an interest in it, let Christian know, let me know. We're happy to spend a little bit more time on that. So I'll leave you my formal slides with this one thought, which is if we don't make small amounts of resources available for experimentation at a modest level, our ventures get really big before they get smart. So think about that.
Let me ask you one question here, Rita. You teach, you meet a lot of executives, and you teach a lot of these executives at Columbia. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to hear, what kind of strategy tools and what kind of innovation tools do they have available to them within the organizations that they sort of come out of?
When they come to my courses?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because even though there are vast, in my mind, lots of research and lots of good tools out there, they tend not to be very well versed in them. They tend to have, you know, if they come in and they say, oh, you know, I want to do this experiment with an A/B test, and they're asking me to fill out the same forms I would have to fill out if I was building a capital plant, you know, so I'd say the tools are at a very primitive level for most companies, which is a surprise when you think about how much discussion there is of innovation and, you know, all these kinds of things. One of the things, Christian, that you and I have done together, which this group of people might be interested in learning more about, is we have an assessment that we do called the Innovation Maturity Scale. And we actually tested it out in Norway for the first time, which was exciting. But what that scale allows you to do is position your organization somewhere from 1, which is basically you're a regulated utility, to an 8, which sounds much more like what Statoil's doing, you know, which is really being very systematic about finding and growing new opportunities. And based on that assessment, you can then decide, well, where is it worth making an investment in building capability in some way? So the things we ask about are your governance process, your funding and metrics process, your people process, and your culture. And it's simple to do. I mean, it takes 10 minutes, but you can get back some very interesting information about where your organization is. And most of the ones that come into my courses are at a pretty low level.
I can only echo that. So it's actually 11 months now, Rita, since we used that tool in Norway with the Norwegian executives. And this innovation maturity scale is really a powerful, very interesting tool.
It is, yeah.
Strongly recommend. So if any of you might be in a position within your team, within your business unit, or within the organization as a whole, to run a survey and a follow-up, because you gotta do the follow-up work, then you should really look up innovation maturity scale. Well, actually, what we'll do is when we close out this webinar, we'll send out, of course, some information. We'll send out the link to the YouTube channel, and we'll also include 1 or 2 pieces on the innovation maturity scale.
Great, that's great.
So you can have a look. Now we have about 10 minutes left, and
we have some questions, don't we?
Q&A.
Oh yes, now we have some plenty of time for some Q&A. So Jolene is waving at me to make sure we do the Q&A. Rita, let me just check. Are you able to see the Q&As where you're sitting?
I think I am. Yep, let me just click on them. Yeah, so the first question I see was, what's the role of the operating model in understanding the nature of constraints and then figuring out an inflection? So this gets to a concept that I call understanding your key metrics. So if you think about any organization, the constraints that they face usually translate into the measures that they use to define performance. So the fundamental constraint of an airline, for example, is once the plane's taken off, you can't put any more people on it. And so all your key metrics are passenger miles per, passenger seat miles flown, cost per passenger mile, yada, 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 all because your major constraint has to do with you just, once it's in the air, you can't do anything. So an inflection point is something that changes. Now that could be a technology change, it could be a social change, it could be, something that shifts in the environment that puts, that makes those other constraints go away, or that imposes new ones that mean you have to operate differently in the future. So as an example, 50 years ago, it would have been perfectly normal for people to smoke in conference rooms, in office buildings, in restaurants. That wasn't an activity that was seen as illegitimate. And what's happened is in that half century since, people have said, well, no, second degree smoke is real and it's unpleasant and it's a health risk. And in the United States, at least, that set of constraints has all really changed. So an inflection point and getting early warnings of an inflection point is the first possibility, right, that the constraints might change. But taking strong action at that moment is usually too early. So if I go back to retail, right, back in 1995, poor Fortune magazine laid it all out. When Amazon sold their first book, they said, hey, it's going to eliminate the constraint on retail of space. You're going to be able to sell things without even having any inventory, blah, 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 blah. And all the retailers freaked out. They said, oh my God, this is going to change our business completely. And they poured money. I mean, I don't know if you remember that period, sort of 1995 to about 2000, money went pouring into the internet. And of course, the ecosystem wasn't complete enough yet. Only about 40% of households even had computers at home. We got to the internet by dial-up modems. I mean, if you go back to that, and we didn't know how to pay for things. So the properties that constitute the modern environment for shopping on the internet just didn't exist. And what all the retailers who put money into it at that point took from it was the wrong lesson. They said, this internet thing is a flash in the pan. It's going to go away. It's not something we should take seriously. And so I think the interesting thing about perceiving an inflection point is the second challenge is now how do you make sure that you act within the right time frame, not too late, which is where a lot of retailers are right now, but not too early, so that you're not putting a lot of resource in before the thing's really ready to take off. So does that answer that question, you think?
Well, it's definitely a good start. I think we see that question comes up again in a second. So let's see. We have 2 questions here from Alejandro. So the first question he's asking is, how often do we recommend to work on the canvas model? So, of course, in very fast-moving industries, technology, software. It's really a high pace environment, so it makes sense to work on this much more often. In more slower paced industries, let's just say cement or utilities, traditionally you could say that these were slower moving industries. But at least what we're seeing in a number of client cases and some of the research we've been doing is that because of digital disruption and the funding available for startups, there's very few industries, from healthcare, from energy, oil and gas, that are kind of protected. So we recommend every company in every industry to significantly turn up the pace, and as a consequence, do these kind of business model design exercises much more frequently. And also, I'll just cover the next one, and then I'll pass Veronica's question on to you, Rita. Alejandro is also asking around Porter's tools.
Mm-hmm.
So the traditional strategy tools, they exist, and they're definitely valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think what you need to understand is Porter's tools and a lot of the stuff that's in strategy textbooks today, we're operating in a different set of boundary conditions. You know, if you think of America in the 70s, which is when that stuff started to be developed, you know, Europe was still recovering from the Second World War. China was closed. India was closed. Latin America wasn't part of global competition. Globalization itself had not really taken off. So, you know, if you were a tire company and you manufactured tires, your bets were pretty good. You were going to sell most of them. And so your strategy at that point became picking a position and then defending that position by erecting entry barriers. And so what you had was clear divisions between industries, relatively stable industry division, relatively stable roles within an industry. And the strategy tools that were basically analytical at that time made a lot of sense in those environments. Now, when you've got a situation today where you've got, you know, television competing against Netflix, or Amazon deciding to create original programming, and, you know, what's a bookseller doing making TV shows? You know, you've got this intra-industry competition now, and that's just not a context in which those tools were ever conceived to work. So I think you need to understand the boundary conditions for them. My one big argument with Porter's 5 forces that I think has really eroded a lot is he doesn't have a relationship for complementers. So you're either a buyer or a supplier, or, you know, a substitute, or maybe you're a new entrant. But he doesn't have this situation like Apple, Samsung, right, where they compete viciously in the phone market, but Samsung makes a whole bunch of the gear that goes into Apple's phones. I mean, like, it just doesn't explain that. So I think you've got to be very cognizant that there's some missing pieces there.
No, well said. Actually, I'll tag on that and answer Carolina, Carolina is well known to us. She's hosted a client group that went to Denmark to visit some of their smart city projects, and her question is really on public sector innovation around digital technologies and smart city. Actually, Caroline, I'm developing a new master's program on clean energy revolution, and one of the things that we're doing that is like right into Rita's work is we're developing something that we call the shifting energy arena. Now, traditionally, you have the oil and gas, you have the utility, you have the technology suppliers. What we're seeing is that all of these are sort of blending together. Tesla is a car manufacturer, but it's also a utility company. It's also a technology company. Ford is now partnering with some very, very aggressive clean energy startups. They're investing in energy infrastructure with charging infrastructure. Utilities are now investing in disruptive business models for solar energy and electric car charging, which puts them in a conflict with Ford and Tesla. And this landscape is shifting. And I think the public sector needs to understand this to be able to do a good job. So, Caroline, if I can email you later, I'll try to send some material that might be interesting around the Energy Cloud 4.0 and the implications around that.
Cool, very cool.
Rita, we have a question from Veronica about inflection points in the service sector. You want to try to touch on that?
Sure. So the service sector is not immune. If you think about, take healthcare, for example. if you were thinking about getting a pregnancy test when I was a little girl, right? You had to take fluid from a woman and you injected it into a rabbit, and if the rabbit died, you were pregnant. I mean, that was the pregnancy test back then. I'm not making this up, by the way. That's true. There used to be situation comedies where somebody would come home and say, "Oh, honey, the rabbit died," and that was good news. And we're like, "What?" Anyway, so today, if you take that desire to understand what whether you're pregnant or not, you take yourself to a drugstore, you buy a kit, you go home on your own, and you do it, and you're done. And so the inflection point in something like healthcare is increasingly things that used to require specialists and services to provide are being done. They're moving to be simpler. They're done self-service. They're done yourself. And a whole lot of those professionals that were doing that activity now find that they've been replaced by technology in some way. So that would be an example of the kind of inflection points we're seeing. So today, we're right on the brink of using artificial intelligence and machine learning to be able to do things that are actually, humans used to do. So, anything that involves pattern recognition or, putting together analyses that are fairly routine, we're going to see the advent of the machines coming to do that, a lot of that. So what I think is interesting about that is, and I have a technology colleague who says, well, the problem with work for most of human history has been that people are just really poor substitutes for robots. Henry Ford always said, look, if I just want a pair of hands, why do I have to take the person that comes with it, right? And so we really are at a moment where we're asking, well, does the work that people do now become creative work that only people can do, and machine intelligence can't do it yet because it's not programmed by an algorithm? Or are people going to be rendered less and less useful in some meaningful way? And we don't really know the answer to that yet, but we do know that there's some kind of major inflection coming.
Yeah. Actually, we're going to, just for everyone who's still here in the webinar, we will make sure to answer all questions. So if we're moving around a little bit, stay with us. We'll get there. Rita, I think I want to tag onto that question with a follow-up question from Christian. He says, inflection points are really important. But unfortunately, we discover them too late. Mm-hmm. So how can strategists and innovators focus and work differently so that we can understand, communicate, and create understanding within sort of decision-making levels much earlier than we traditionally do? How do we understand inflection points earlier?
Yeah, and that's really the crux of the book. So here's the argument I would make. Something that feels like an inflection point, it has usually been brewing for a long time, sometimes a really long time. So what you need is some way of detecting the early warnings. And what I talk about in the book is creating what I call time zero events. So a time zero event is when the inflection point has arrived and everybody can look at it and say, there it is, it's absolutely clear. And what you do then is, once you've crystallized what those are, so that's what it would look like if it happened, then you work backward in time and say, what would we have to be able to observe 6 months before, 12 months before, as far back as you want to go. And then you define at those points, what are the indicators that would tell us this is more or less likely to be happening. And then what you can do is you say, okay, make a person responsible for capturing that information so that anybody that runs across a relevant bit of data now has somewhere to send it. So my argument would be, it's not impossible to anticipate these things. I think it is impossible to predict them. It's prediction is difficult, right? But I think it is possible to become much more alert and much more aware and sort of move your time frame back. And that's one of the tools that I use to do it. In the book, I also talk about sort of leadership principles. Things like, Andy Grove had a wonderful phrase for this. He said, if you think about it, snow melts from the edges. And what he meant by that was, some big inflection point in your business does not present itself neatly in the corporate boardroom on the day that you happen to be thinking about it. It starts out with a weird conversation with a customer, or somebody returned your product because of something you didn't expect, or there's some new competitor that is like from a completely different industry and people are saying, no, I'll have that instead. So it starts out at the periphery of your organization. And what a lot of senior executives don't understand is that's where they need to be. They need to be out on the front lines, talking to customers, listening to what the changes are, going to trade shows, maybe in an industry that's not their own, learning from experiences that are not theirs. One of the things I always think is a shame is I'll go talk to people about, say, doing some consulting work. You probably run into this all the time, Christian. And they'll say things like, well, what do you know about industry X? We only want people with deep expertise about industry X. And what I try to convey to them is, maybe you want somebody who's really ignorant about industry X because they're not baked in with the same ratios and metrics and criteria that, that you would have if you were in that industry a long time. So I think getting that diversity of perspective is critical.
We're gonna take two questions from Murali. Question one is: Agile is the only funded aspect of innovation that seems to exist nowadays. Of course, Steve Denning have written recently about agile innovation. Mm-hmm. So how do you push innovation in your practice? And that's the second question is: we're called for fixing usually because they don't see any ROI with just agile, but end up with not much budgets. So I think the question here, Rita, is how do we get funding for some of these questions, and then how do we see kind of the emerging practice that Steve Denning is covering in his new book?
Yeah, he is. He talks about it a lot. And I think it's a wonderful book, by the way. It's very interesting and very thoughtful, well researched. It's called The Age of Agile. So I could put in a plug for Steve's book. So one of the things we're working on as a research project is we've developed a metric that we call the imagination premium. And what that basically does is it calculates how much of your worth as a company, how much of your market capitalization is a function of your growth. So what people expect to get from future growth versus from operations. And if you take your value of growth and divide it by your value of operations, you get an imagination premium. And what we like about that number is it links together something, executives care about, which is what's their market cap, to investor expectations for growth. So if you look at Amazon, for example, their imagination premium is 2.92. Now, what that means is only a quarter of that company's value to the market comes from what their operating profits are, because they don't make operating profits much. Everything else is growth. And as soon as people stop believing in their growth story, it's going to be problematic. So let me come back to Tesla. And right now, there's half the market says Tesla's a car company, don't fool us. And the other half of the market says, no, they're a battery company, an energy company, they're going to be disruptive. And the market's very ambivalent about Tesla. So they missed one of their manufacturing milestones a few weeks ago. And within 2 days, their market cap dropped by over $6 billion. So here's the end of the answer, which is what we're trying to work on are metrics that are related to investments in growth as opposed to investments in operating efficiently. And companies that are higher up on that innovation maturity scale I mentioned earlier actually have corporate governance and funding processes around their new business development portfolio. And so if you're in a company where it's really impossible to get budget for anything unless you can demonstrate an ROI, not good at all.
Yeah, no, it's of course a lot of organizations that have this strategy as analysis as kind of the operating model. Any kind of exploration funding, any kind of small experiments is going to be very difficult because it doesn't fit.
Right.
Now we have a few questions left. I'm going to take one from Marco Rilo. So Marco is a wonderful Lego or a serious play facilitator and a very experienced consultant within this field. So I'm very glad to have him with us tonight. So his question is really on the Peanuts case. So absolutely, Marco, I covered it very, very briefly, very high level, kind of going down to the facilitation side of it. What we did was a number of evenings. That was kind of when they had available time because they were all billing clients during the daytime. So spread over probably 6 to maybe 9 months, we worked together to create some basic understanding. Why do we need any kind of change, which was not obvious from the get-go. We explored and we had a lot of good conversations. And as we started working and as we were getting going, we introduced first the business model canvas and then the 3 level of business models. And as we were moving from kind of crazy ideas and into more elaborate designs, more solid business concepts, we worked quite vividly, quite actively on the business model canvas, and mostly on the 3 levels of business models to sort of hash this out. And it was really the structure of the tools that drove the conversation over time. So that's Marco, I'd be very happy to elaborate more on that, but it was definitely a time process, getting people together, getting them in the room, bringing the right tools, and then eventually it was more of a test and learn, as most of you are familiar with. We have a question from Sue Cohen. Maybe Rita, you want to take that. How do CEOs change the language of innovation or value creation to enable new business models? So how does the CEO lead the business model design?
Sure. So I think what I often get asked, where do you start as a CEO or as a senior leader, or even farther down, where do you start? And I would recommend you start with your own agenda. And I mean that incredibly literally. So I'll often get called by companies who are struggling with innovation, and I'll say, send me the last agendas for the meetings that you held when important people got together to talk about important stuff. And I looked through that agenda and I asked, well, where is it? Where is innovation or new business development or whatever your concept is? And I'm telling you, if it's item number 14, right next to material safety data sheet update, what does that tell people? It tells them they're not paying attention. And they're not interested. It's not getting senior management attention. In a company that really means it, I will see innovation somewhere in the top 3, whatever you call it, whatever your company growth or value or whatever. And when you meet the CEO, the first question you'll be asked is, how's that new business program coming? There are dedicated meetings set aside where the innovation teams come in and get executive time on the calendar. So a hugely important way that executives set the innovation agenda literally is their agenda, and then all the symbolism that goes with it. So who do they talk to? What questions do they ask? Are they interested? Are they and a great symbolic example of this was the former CEO of Emerson Electric had an office next to his own office, and he called it the Innovation War Room. And every single division in the company had each of its projects in the war room. The height of the project was the difference they would make to the company potentially. Where it was horizontally was what stage of development the project was in, and each division had a different color. Right. And no meeting with this guy would take place without at least 5 minutes in the war room. No meeting. And certainly no performance review. And so that's a way of saying, not just words, right? I'm taking executive time, I'm taking real estate, and in this case it was manual, but you could easily do this digitally. We're going to make it obvious that this is something I really care about. And if you don't have that, this organization understands that. The other big thing to watch out for is don't put innovation projects in the hands of people who happen to be available. You really want the innovation practices to be places where people see as desirable for my career. I want to go there. I want to work on that. The best people go there. Because if you put rejects and misfits and people that just are not seen as go-getters in the company on innovation, that again sends a very strong message.
Oh, very, very well said. We have a question from Emily Bulger. Are the employees working on these different business models? Or are they, separated? And if so, what are the tools geared to facilitating this coordination? Now, there are many schools of thought here. As a principle, at least we advise different people on different business models. Mm-hmm. Full-time, allocated resources. They need the time, the funding, the space, culture, appetite for risk, and all of a sudden they grow into becoming very different projects, very different business models, and potentially very different companies. So we have a large transportation company that we're working with, and they have about 14,000 employees, and they're starting to look into mobility as a service, digital technologies, maybe even acquiring some autonomous vehicle companies. But they have 3 people doing this part-time, mostly on weekends and nights. And I think that's challenging. So the high-level advice here is really make sure that people have the time and the resources allocated to do it properly.
Right. Yeah, a lot of these innovation efforts are self-defeating because they're born handicapped. So the one cautionary note I would give is how separate your innovations are is going to be also a function of how much you need to borrow from the parent. So if you're counting on the parent company's brand or marketing team or technology team or something, you need to build integration mechanisms there. If it's a completely different model and it really doesn't need to deal with the mothership very much, then I think the more separate is the better. Clearly, you can't count on innovation, happening in nights and weekends. I mean, if you believe in it, that's just what I call innovation theater, right? And innovation theater is awesome. We all fly off to Silicon Valley, and thousands of Post-it notes die, and and it's all great, but then you don't really mean it because you're not putting people full time on it. You're not giving it serious resources. They don't have access to the decision makers. It's just innovation theater, and that's like a level 1 or 2 in my innovation maturity scale. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to jump off to join another call. So I don't mean to abandon you. If you have questions, I commit to, Christian, if you or Jolene shoot them over to me, I'll give you my best answers. And lovely meeting you all.
Rita, thank you very much. I am aware that we're 15 minutes over time. We're going to close out the last questions because we'll answer every question, and we'll do that fairly briefly. Rita, thank you very much for joining. It's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. Talk to you soon. And next time in Norway, huh?
Yes, please. All right, so we're gonna see if we can wrap this up. We have a few questions left. We have a question from Katarina Maya. I see the advent of Industry 4.0 as a major inflection point for industries and the state itself. What advice can we give on applying these principles of the inflection point at the state level? Well, I think the story right now of Flint, Michigan, or even Detroit, Michigan, or some of the other cities, former thriving industry cities that are now going through despair, is scary. And I think that if the government and the state doesn't keep up with level of innovation, level of inflection points, we can see a lot more of these. Our next webinar is on something that we've developed that we call the innovation superclusters. And innovation superclusters is really government tools to how do we accelerate innovation on a national or regional or state level? How do we build industries that are fit for the future? And how do we as a government develop future fit and future oriented innovation strategies to really sort of raise innovation not on the corporate level but at a regional and national level? So maybe, Katarina, you'll find our next webinar in about 2 weeks' time to be very relevant to your question. But we have a few more questions before we round off today. Murali asks, so who engages with innovation practitioners? If Agile comes from the division head or IT, who do you get the first calls from? Well, I think innovation should be embedded with many parts of the organization, and innovation practitioners should really be available. They should be networking. They should be accessible. They should be influencing the IT side and the division head. Because a lot of companies look at innovation mostly as technology, which is, of course, a part of innovation. But in our tool, the innovation pyramid, we explain the 9 levels of innovation, where one of the levels, of course, is technology, but a deeper level, more impactful level is business model innovation. So I think an important job that we all do and discuss this in depth with Rita is how do we help people understand the language of business model innovation and expand beyond just products, services, or technologies. And then I see we have, I think, one more question from Veronica. Question is there a way to access Rita's toolkit? And yes, absolutely. Basically, you go online to valise.com. We're going to make sure that you get this by email once we finish up this webinar. Go to valise.com, VALISE.com, and you can have a look around there. And if you want to have sort of the full package, you can just email Rita's representatives, and they'll set up an account for you. It's really interesting, and it's really worth checking out, and it has a lot of features that I believe is very relevant to companies. Veronica, it's my pleasure. So we are just about to round off. We're about 20 minutes over time, and we have quite a number of people still here. So thank you for your time. I am gonna suggest, just very briefly, that maybe you guys want to join us for our next webinar on innovation superclusters. Innovation superclusters, we have been working with the Malaysian government. We are now working with some Norwegian government representatives on how do we develop next generation innovation thinking at a government level rather than a company level. So that is May 3rd at 3 o'clock Central European time. So if you enjoyed this webinar, you can find our previous webinars on YouTube, or you can join us on May 3rd. So my name is Chris. You met Rita, and we also have Jolene with us here today. So with that, I'm going to close out, and I wish you all a very, very good evening, afternoon, night, wherever you might be. And thank you for joining, and thank you for tuning out. And good luck on your business model portfolio. It's a very challenging, but it's a very important job that you're doing. Thank you, and goodbye.